I came to America in 1978 with $40 in my pocket and a suitcase held shut with a bungee cord. I thought that was enough. I was 23 years old, and I believed that hard work was the only currency that mattered in this country. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was right about that one. My name is Walt Greer. I grew up in Harlan County, Kentucky, coal country, where the hills are beautiful and the work will kill you slow if you let it. My father worked the mines. His father worked the mines. His father worked the mines. When I was 17, I watched my father cough himself halfway to death on a Tuesday morning, and I made a decision right then that I would not be doing that. I left at 18, bounced around Louisville for a few years doing odd jobs, loading trucks, laying drywall, anything that paid, and then I ended up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I have lived ever since. I got my electrician's license when I was 26. Started working for a commercial contractor named Bill Stafford, a fair man who paid fair wages and never once made me feel like I was anything less than what I was. I worked for Bill for 11 years. I learned everything from him. When he retired in 1994, he offered to sell me his client list and his truck for $12,000. I borrowed $8,000 from the credit union and paid the rest from savings. That was the beginning of Greer Electrical. I never talked about money. That's a thing you have to understand about me before any of the rest of this makes sense. My mother raised me to believe that talking about what you had was the fastest way to lose it. You kept your head down. You did the work. You let the numbers speak for themselves in private, in a ledger, in a savings account, never out loud at the dinner table. So when people looked at me, at my work boots and my calloused hands and the same Ford F-150 I'd been driving for 9 years, they drew their own conclusions. I let them. It was easier that way. I have 2 kids. My son, Patrick, lives in Raleigh and works in logistics. He's a good man. Quiet like me, doesn't ask for much. My daughter, June, lives here in Charlotte, about 20 minutes from my house. And she has her mother's laugh and her mother's stubbornness. And I love her so much, it sometimes physically hurts to look at her. June's mother, my wife Carol, passed in 2018 from ovarian cancer. That was the worst year of my life. Carol and I had been married 31 years, and she was the only person on earth who knew everything about me. After she died, it was just me rattling around in a house that suddenly felt about twice as big as it needed to be. June called every day for 6 months. She drove over on Sundays and made sure I ate something that wasn't from a drive-through. She is, without question, the best thing I ever had any part in making. She started dating a man named Griffin about 2 years after her mother died. She called me on a Wednesday night to tell me about him. I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table going through invoices when the phone rang. "Dad," she said, "I met someone and I think he might actually be the one." I asked what he did for a living. "He's in finance," she said, "private equity." I didn't say anything to that. I just asked if he made her happy. "Yeah," she said, and the way she said it, quietly, like she was almost surprised, that was enough for me. I met Griffin for the first time at a restaurant June chose, a nice Italian place near Uptown. I wore clean jeans and a button-down shirt that Carol had bought me years ago. It still fit. Griffin was already there when I arrived, sitting across from June in a jacket that probably cost more than my first truck payment. He was good-looking in that pressed, managed kind of way. Hair that sat exactly right. Handshake that was too firm, the kind where a man is trying to tell you something. He was polite. I'll give him that. He asked questions and nodded at the answers and laughed at the right moments. But there was something underneath it all that I noticed and filed away. The way his eyes moved around the room when I was talking. The slight pause before he asked what I did for work. The way he absorbed my answer. "Electrician," I said. "Oh," he said. "Just that." "Oh." And then he turned to June and asked if she'd tried the Branzino here before. I noticed. I didn't say anything. June was happy, that was what mattered. Over the following months, I saw Griffin at family dinners, at June's birthday, at Christmas, He was always pleasant to my face. Always. He held doors and poured wine and complimented the food. But he never asked me a second question about my work. He never asked about the company. He had, in whatever private sorting system he used for people, placed me in a category, and once you were in a category with a man like Griffin, you stayed there. Patrick told me to Easter that Griffin had referred to me as June's dad the handyman at some event. Patrick heard it from a friend of Griffin's girlfriend. I told Patrick to let it go. Dad, let it go, I said. It was around October when June called to tell me Griffin had proposed. She was crying, the good kind of crying, and I sat there in my kitchen holding the phone, and I said, "Baby, if he makes you happy, that's what I want." And I meant it. I meant every word of it. She asked if I would help pay for the wedding. "Of course," I said. "Whatever you need." What she needed, it turned out, was a great deal. Griffin's family had ideas. His mother, a woman named Phyllis who wore her hair in a way that seemed to require daily maintenance, had a vision for the wedding that involved a venue called the Harrington House, which is a restored antebellum estate outside Charlotte that does events. I knew the property. I had done the electrical work when they rewired it in 2009. I also knew it cost $8,000 just to rent the main hall for an evening. The budget Griffin's family proposed was $220,000. They expected June's family, meaning me, to split it evenly. June called me privately, embarrassed, and said she didn't expect me to match that. She said she was going to tell them we couldn't. "What did you want the wedding to look like?" I asked her. "Dad, it doesn't matter." "What did you want?" She got quiet. Then she said softly, "I always wanted something really beautiful, something Mum would have loved." I told her to tell them yes, the full amount. She went silent for a long moment. "Dad, that's $110,000. "I know what it is," I said. "Tell them yes." She started crying again, different kind this time. What June didn't know, what almost nobody knew, is that Greer Electrical had been doing quite well for a long time. When I say quite well, I mean that by 2015, we had 32 employees and contracts with 4 commercial developers in the Charlotte metro area. I had also, over the years, taken a portion of what the business generated and invested it, slowly, carefully, in real estate. Nothing flashy. Industrial properties, small commercial strips, one storage facility out in Concord. By the time June got engaged, I had 7 properties in my portfolio. I managed them through a holding company called Cornerstone Property Group, LLC, which sounded like it could belong to anybody. I drove a 2016 Ford F-150 with 94,000 miles on it. I ate lunch at Bojangles most weekdays. I owned 3 pairs of work boots and I rotated them. The people in my life, outside of my accountant and my attorney, had no idea. The wedding was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday in May. As the date got closer, I noticed the way Griffin spoke to me begin to shift. Not worse, exactly, but more transparent. He stopped performing politeness and started just tolerating. At a dinner in March, he spent the entire evening talking with his father about a deal they were working on in Atlanta. And when I asked a question about it, just a simple question about the financing structure, Griffin looked at me for a moment with something that was not quite contempt and not quite amusement, and said, "It's pretty complicated stuff, Walt." Walt, not Mr. Greer, not Sir. Walt, the way you'd talk to a man who fixed your outlets. June changed the subject. She always did. She had a mother's grace in that way. 2 weeks before the wedding, Griffin's mother called me directly. She wanted to discuss the cake. They had found a baker in Charleston, South Carolina, a woman who did custom sculpted cakes for what Phyllis described as high-end events. The cake they wanted was 5 tiers, hand-decorated with sugar flowers, and required the baker to travel to Charlotte and spend 2 days on-site assembling it. The price was $7,400. I said that was fine. Phyllis paused. I think she expected pushback. When she didn't get it, she just said, "Wonderful," and moved on. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my living room with the lights off for a while. I thought about Carol. I thought about how much she would have loved to see June in a wedding dress, how she would have cried from the moment June walked out of the dressing room and not stopped until the reception ended. I thought about how I would walk June down the aisle alone, no hand on my arm, just my daughter and me, the way we had navigated most of the last several years. I wore a suit I had owned for 12 years. It was a dark navy wool suit, well-made, Brooks Brothers, that Carol had insisted I buy for a client dinner back in 2012. I had it cleaned and pressed. I did not buy a new one. I did not need to. The wedding was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that because it's true and because June deserved it. The Harrington house looked extraordinary. June looked extraordinary. June looked extraordinary. She came down the staircase in her dress, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment before I could look back at her. The ceremony was perfect, short, honest, the kind of vows that feel like they were written by two specific people for two specific people rather than borrowed from somewhere. I sat in the front row with Patrick, and I held it together. I did. The reception was where it fell apart. It started small. I was at the bar getting a club soda. I don't drink, haven't since my 30s, when Griffin's brother, a man named Todd, came up beside me and ordered a whiskey and said, without quite looking at me, "So Walt, you doing okay over there? I know this must be a stretch financially." I looked at him. "June mentioned you really went all out," he said. "We appreciate it, truly." "June shouldn't have said anything," I said. He shrugged and took his drink and walked away. Then it was the seating. I was at a table near the back of the room, in a group that included June's college friends and a cousin of mine who'd driven up from Rock Hill. Griffin's family had the front two tables, his parents, his grandmother, his brother, assorted cousins, closer to the wedding party. I was where I was. I told myself it didn't matter. I ate my dinner. I talked with June's friends, who were warm and funny. I watched my daughter dance with her new husband, and I felt, underneath everything else, genuinely happy for her. Then came the cake. It was brought out on a rolling table by the catering staff, all 5 tiers of it, the sugar flowers catching the light. It really was something to look at. June's face, when she saw it, was worth every dollar. They did the tradition of the cake cutting, the gentle feeding to each other, the careful poses for photographs. And then the photographer stepped back, and the guests started pressing closer, and somewhere in the shifting crowd, I ended up near the front. I don't know how Griffin saw me. We'd barely spoken all evening, but he caught my eye across the cake table, and something moved across his face, something quick and cold. And then he reached over and picked up June's plate with the slice of cake on it and held it out toward me. "Here, Walt," he said, loudly enough that the people nearby could hear. "Have some cake. Treat yourself. You've earned it." There was a smile on his face, but it did not reach his eyes. I took the plate. I said, "Thank you." "Must be nice," he said, still smiling, still loud, "getting to enjoy a party like this on someone else's dime. Living the dream, huh, buddy?" Someone near us laughed, nervous, uncertain. June was 6 feet away talking to her maid of honor and hadn't heard yet. I looked at Griffin. I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that his smile began to go uncertain at the edges. And I said very quietly, "Excuse me a moment." I set the plate down on the table. I walked across the reception hall and found the venue's event coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who I happened to know personally from the 2009 rewiring job. I asked her if she could find the general manager. She looked at me with a different kind of expression than most people there had used with me that evening. The kind that comes from knowing who someone actually is. "Of course, Mr. Greer," she said. "Right away." I went back to my table and sat down. I drank my club soda. I watched Griffin across the room holding court with his brothers, laughing, comfortable, certain. The general manager came over to my table 4 minutes later. His name was Rob Fielding, and I had spoken with him twice on the phone in the past year about a potential HVAC-related electrical upgrade for the property. He sat down next to me and leaned in and said quietly, "Everything okay? Sandra said you needed me." "Everything's fine," I said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew I was here in case anything came up." He nodded slowly. He understood. What Rob Fielding understood, and what Griffin did not know, was that Cornerstone Property Group, LLC, was in the final stages of acquiring Harrington House. We had been under contract for 4 months. The deal was scheduled to close in 3 weeks. Harrington House, the venue Griffin's family had chosen for the wedding, would belong to me before June was back from her honeymoon. I had not planned for this moment. I want to be clear about that. I didn't choose the venue. I didn't engineer any of it. June's future in-laws had picked it, and I had quietly decided not to say anything because I didn't think it mattered, and because I don't believe in making things about me when they should be about my daughter. I was sitting at my table when it happened. Griffin, emboldened by whatever version of himself he'd decided to be that evening, had apparently said something else. Something to his brother Todd, something about the handyman sitting in the back. I didn't hear it directly, but June heard it. She came from across the room with a stillness in her face that looked exactly like her mother's when Carol was at the end of her patience. I watched June say something to Griffin in a low, controlled voice. I watched his expression flicker. I watched him wave his hand dismissively and say something back. Then Todd said, in a voice that carried, "June, come on. Your dad's a great guy. He's not exactly in the same bracket here. We're not judging him for it." The room did not go entirely quiet, but it went quieter. June turned and looked at me across the room. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Don't!" But Rob Fielding had been standing nearby with a glass of water, and he had heard Todd, and I truly did not ask him to do this. He walked over to Griffin and Todd and said in his professional, measured way, "I just want to make sure our ownership is aware of any concerns this evening. Is there something I can help with?" Griffin looked at him blankly. "Ownership?" "Yes," Rob said. "Mr. Greer is the acquiring owner of this property. We close in 3 weeks. I want to make sure his daughter's event goes perfectly." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard at a party. Griffin turned and looked at me. I picked up my club soda and took a sip. "I don't," Griffin started. He stopped. He started again. "What does that mean, acquiring owner?" "It means," Rob said pleasantly, "that Mr. Greer's company is purchasing Harrington House. He'll be our new owner of record as of the 30th. Todd said nothing. Phyllis, who had appeared from somewhere, said nothing. June was looking at me with her mother's eyes, and her hand was over her mouth. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, the 12-year-old suit, the Brooks Brothers, the one Carol had picked, and I walked over to where Griffin was standing. He was a half-inch taller than me and 25 years younger, and in that moment, he looked about 17. I didn't say anything dramatic. I had thought, in some theoretical version of this moment, that I might have something sharp and memorable to say. But standing there, looking at him, I just felt tired, and I felt June behind me, and I thought about Carol, and I said, quietly just to him, "I paid for this wedding because June asked me to. Not to impress you, not to prove anything, because she's my daughter, and she wanted something beautiful, and I could give it to her. That's all this was." He didn't say anything. I turned to June and I said, "You look like your mother tonight. She would have been so proud." June started crying. She walked over and hugged me, and I held on for a moment longer than I probably should have. Patrick appeared from somewhere and clapped me on the shoulder once. That's his version of a speech. The reception continued. People danced. The band played. Phyllis found a reason to be in another part of the room. Griffin was quieter for the rest of the evening, which I thought was probably good for everyone. I left at 9:30. I had an early morning. I still work most Saturdays, force of habit. I said good night to June, and she held my face in her hands the way she used to when she was 4 years old and said, "I love you, Dad." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," I said. "Go dance with your husband." I drove home in the F-150 with the windows down. It was a warm May night and the city was lit up, and I thought about all the years of early mornings and late invoices and decisions made quietly, without ceremony, that had added up to something. I thought about a man in a good suit who thought he had me figured out from across a dinner table. I pulled into my driveway at 10. I sat in the truck for a minute before I went inside. The lights in the house were all off. I had left them that way. I didn't need much light to find my way around my own home. I still drive the F-150. 112,000 miles on it now. It runs fine. I have thought about that night more times than I expected to. Not about Griffin's face when Rob said what he said, though I'd be lying if I told you I never replay that moment. I think about the drive home, the windows down, the city lit up, the truck that needed nothing from me except gas and an oil change every 5,000 miles. There is a thing that happens when you spend 40-some years building something quietly. You start to understand that the building itself is the point, not the arrival, not the moment someone finally sees it. The building, the early mornings and the unpaid invoices and the decisions you make alone at a kitchen table with the lights on at midnight, those are the thing. Griffin never understood that because men like Griffin are taught from the beginning that the appearance of having is the same as having. It isn't, not even close. I don't have any bitterness toward him. I want to say that clearly because I mean it. He is a young man who learned a bad lesson early and hasn't been corrected yet. Maybe he will be. Maybe June will be the one who does it. She has her mother's patience when she decides to use it, and her mother could change the temperature of a room just by knowing when to stay quiet. What I keep coming back to is this. I never hid what I had because I was ashamed of it. I hid it because I understood, from a very early age, that the moment you tell people what you're worth, they stop seeing you and start seeing the number. My father taught me that without meaning to. He was a man who had very little, and people treated him accordingly, and he never once complained about it. He just kept working. That kind of integrity, the kind that doesn't require an audience, is the hardest thing to hold on to and the most valuable thing I know how to pass down. June has it. Patrick has it. I see it in the way they move through the world without needing to announce themselves. That is not something you can buy or fake. You either do the work to become it or you don't. I think about the suit, too. The 12-year-old Brooks Brothers that Carol picked out for a client dinner in 2012. I could walk into any store in Charlotte and spend $3,000 on something new tomorrow. I don't, because the suit fits, and because Carol chose it, and because I don't need a new one. That's not poverty. That's a man who knows what things are actually for. Griffin seated me in the back of that reception hall because he had decided, based on my boots and my truck and the way I answered his question about what I did for a living, that I did not belong at the front. And maybe that's the part I want people to hear. Not the twist. Not the property deal. The part before all of that. The part where I sat down at my assigned table and I ate my dinner and I talked to June's friends and I watched my daughter dance. I did not make a scene. I did not correct anyone. I just kept being exactly who I was, the same way I've been doing since I was 23 years old, with $40 and a bungee-corded suitcase. That's what I know. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. You just have to still be standing when the room finally goes quiet enough to see clearly. I still drive the F-150.